The night was thick with tension, the air heavy and still. Sirens hummed faintly in the distance, but for the moment, the streets felt deceptively quiet, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Detective John Johnson, his badge gleaming like a beacon of power under the dim streetlights, cruised the darkened streets of the district. He had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, a place he'd come to know far too well, and where everyone had a role in the grand, unspoken order of things. He was the law, and he made sure everyone knew it. His patrol car was a fortress of certainty, cutting through the silence with the heavy thrum of its engine. Inside, Johnson's eyes narrowed, scanning the street like a hawk on the hunt. His mind was never far from the next suspect, the next opportunity to flex his authority. He was used to control. He relished it. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged, walking at a brisk pace down the sidewalk. A tall, well-built black man, his face barely visible beneath the hood of his jacket. There was something about the man that didn't fit. Johnson's instincts flared up, and his hand automatically gripped the wheel tighter. This was a chance, a moment to remind the world of who was really in charge. Johnson slowed the car, pulling up beside the man with a precision that spoke volumes. The engine idled, the growl of the exhaust reverberating through the night. He rolled down the window, his gaze cold, unblinking. "Hey!" Johnson's voice was sharp, the command hanging in the air like a gauntlet thrown. "You! Stop right there!" The man froze, his back straightening. There was a fleeting moment of hesitation, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He turned, facing the car, but his eyes never met Johnson's directly. His stance was casual, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken. Was it defiance? Was it recognition? Johnson didn't know, but he didn't care. "Everything all right?" The man's voice was steady, but there was something in it that nagged at Johnson. The calmness, the cool demeanor. "License and registration," Johnson barked, his tone laced with the command of a man who knew he had the power to ruin someone's night. He'd done it countless times before. "You're walking around here at this hour, looking suspicious as hell. Where are you going?" The man stood still for a moment, seemingly assessing the situation. Johnson watched closely, his patience thinning. Was the man going to make a scene? Was he going to challenge his authority? His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, a rhythm of arrogance that spoke louder than words. "Can I ask why you're stopping me?" The man's voice was low but firm, the calmness unnerving to Johnson. "What's the issue here?" Johnson's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to this, to someone questioning him, especially in this neighborhood where people knew their place. It was supposed to be simple. He was supposed to be in charge. And this man, standing there, unfazed by the authority in his eyes, was making it complicated. "I don't like your tone," Johnson snapped. "You want to make this difficult? I can make it difficult." His hand hovered near the radio, prepared to call for backup, prepared to escalate if he needed to. There was no room for challenges, not from people like this. The man exhaled slowly, as if considering the weight of Johnson's words. His eyes flickered for a split second, just long enough for Johnson to catch the glint of something in them. And for just that moment, Johnson felt something stir in his gut, a creeping sensation that he couldn't quite place. "Maybe I'm just out for a walk," the man said, his voice cool and measured, betraying nothing. "Maybe I don't need to explain myself to you." Johnson gritted his teeth, his frustration mounting. "I said license and registration." He was losing patience. "Now." There was a long pause, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the man's posture shifted. He straightened his shoulders, his expression changing. The air seemed to thicken, as if the weight of the moment was suddenly more than just a routine stop. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out an ID. As he handed it to Johnson, there was no fear in his eyes, no anger, just a steady calm. "Here," the man said, his voice still calm, but now carrying an undertone of something else, something deeper. "You might want to take a look at who you're talking to." Johnson stared at the ID for a moment, his heart skipping a beat. The name on the card was not what he expected. It was a name that made his blood run cold, his body stiffen in disbelief. For a brief, terrifying moment, Johnson forgot how to breathe. The man standing before him was no random citizen. He wasn't some suspect on a routine patrol. He was someone far more powerful, far more dangerous. He was the head of internal affairs. And in that instant, everything changed. Johnson's mind raced, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him. What had started as an ordinary stop, a simple display of power, had turned into a nightmare he couldn't escape. But it was too late. The moment had already passed. The streets were empty, save for the flickering glow of streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the asphalt. The air was thick, almost suffocating, but Johnson didn't mind it. The tension that filled the night was exactly what he thrived on. It made him feel alive, powerful. This wasn't just another stop. This was a moment for him to remind the city who held the real power, and there was no better way to remind them than by using the one thing he knew best: fear. He had already made the fatal mistake of underestimating the man, assuming that he was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Johnson's arrogance wouldn't let him back down now. He was the law, and everyone had to obey, regardless of who they were or where they came from. He didn't care about his mistake. All he cared about was reclaiming control. "License and registration," he demanded again, his voice dripping with authority, almost as if he enjoyed the moment. The man's expression was unreadable. He stood there, calm, unnervingly calm, despite Johnson's clear attempt to provoke him. His eyes were locked on the officers, not with fear, but with something that made Johnson feel uncomfortable. It was a challenge, silent, but strong. But Johnson refused to back down. He would break him. "Come on, man, don't make this harder than it needs to be," Johnson taunted, his voice mocking. He glanced around the empty street, making sure there were no witnesses. "You know how this works. You don't have the luxury of being untouchable. Not here. Not in my city." The man didn't flinch, didn't move an inch, but there was a glimmer in his eyes. A warning. "You're just another thug," Johnson continued, his words laced with venom. "Another criminal walking these streets thinking you can just get away with whatever you want. You know what I see when I look at you. Just another problem, another scumbag to clean up." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He remained still, unfazed, but Johnson could feel the tension between them building. It was almost as if the man was daring him to make the next move, to do something, anything, that would give him an excuse to escalate the situation. Johnson's chest swelled with the need to prove something, to show this man that he was the one in control. "You think you're better than me?" Johnson spat, the words coming out more venomous than he intended. "You think, because you're all dressed up and playing the role of some kind of big shot, you're untouchable. I can do whatever I want. I don't have to follow the rules. I am the rules." The man finally spoke, his voice soft but full of defiance. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his tone almost pitying. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Johnson's lips curled into a sneer. He was no longer interested in playing it safe. He didn't care about the man's words. This was his moment to dominate, to show everyone around them who was the real authority. "Shut your mouth!" Johnson barked. "You don't get to talk to me like that, not in my town." The man didn't flinch, didn't react, but Johnson noticed a slight shift in his posture, something that told him the man wasn't afraid, wasn't intimidated. "Here's how it's going to work," Johnson said, taking a step closer, his voice lowering. "You're going to get on your knees, put your hands on your head, and you're going to beg me not to make your life a living hell. You're going to show me respect, and if you do, maybe, just maybe, I'll let you go without a record. Otherwise, we're going to have a real problem. And trust me, you don't want to make me your problem." The man's eyes locked with his once again. "You're not the one with the power here," he said calmly, almost like he wasn't even speaking to Johnson. His voice was steady, unfazed by the threats. It was the kind of calm that unnerved Johnson. Johnson's fist clenched at his side. His anger flared. "You think you can talk to me like that? Do you think you're untouchable? Some kind of king? You're nothing but a black man on my streets, and I can do whatever I want to you. You're nothing more than a statistic." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a darkness that stretched far beyond the confines of this one moment. Johnson took another step closer, his voice a low growl. "I could ruin you right now, and you wouldn't be able to do a damn thing about it." For the first time, the man's eyes betrayed something. A flicker of understanding. He knew what Johnson was trying to do, the game he was playing, but he wasn't going to let the officer win. He wasn't going to back down. "I'm not afraid of you," the man said, his voice firm, almost dismissive. "Not anymore." That's when it hit Johnson. The realization that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't a random man on the street. This wasn't just some thug he could push around. There was something in the air, something he couldn't put his finger on, but he refused to let it show. He couldn't let his guard down now. "I'll make sure you regret this," Johnson said, his voice sharp and final. "You'll see who has the power here." But as the man turned to walk away, the officer's hand twitched towards his belt, the gun holstered at his side. And for a brief moment, just a fleeting second, Johnson thought about pulling it, just to put the man in his place. But before he could make that decision, the man spoke one last time. "You don't want to do that." And just like that, the tension reached a breaking point. Johnson froze, a chill running down his spine as the words echoed in his mind. But it was already too late. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to know where you're listening to our stories from. Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so you can stay updated with our latest content. Now, let's continue. Johnson could feel the power surging through him, electrifying his every move. He had the man right where he wanted him, completely under his control. Every muscle in his body seemed to pulse with confidence, the kind of arrogance that only a badge could give him. This wasn't just about the stop anymore. This was about domination. The moment he'd been waiting for was here. The man had made a mistake by challenging him, and now he would pay for it. "You're gonna regret this," Johnson muttered under his breath, stepping closer to the man. His hand instinctively brushed against his holstered weapon, but he didn't need to use it yet. No, the true power was in control. The real satisfaction was in bending this man to his will, showing him exactly who was in charge. The man stood still, not moving, his face still expressionless, but Johnson could see the flicker of something, perhaps a glint of recognition or the beginning of doubt, in his eyes. Good, Johnson thought. He was breaking him down. The man had no idea who he was messing with. "All right, let's do this the easy way," Johnson said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Show me your papers now." He demanded it as though it were a favor, an act of mercy. But to Johnson, this was just the beginning of the mental game. He wanted to break the man's spirit, to remind him that even the smallest movements, the slightest mistake, could end his entire life. The man's hand slowly reached for his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet. Johnson watched every motion, every detail, as though he were anticipating a mistake, a reason to escalate things further. It was all part of the plan. As the man handed over his ID, Johnson let his fingers graze over it a little longer than necessary. He was making a statement, reminding the man that he was in charge, that every action had consequences, that every glance was a reminder of the power in his hands. His fingers lingered on the card, examining it with exaggerated care. "Let's see if this checks out," Johnson said, scanning the ID with an intensity that bordered on theatrical. "You're not so untouchable now, are you?" He turned to the radio and called for backup, the words coming out slower than they should. The power of the moment wasn't in calling for assistance. It was in making the man wait, making him squirm. Every second of silence that stretched between them was another moment of humiliation. Johnson was making him pay for every ounce of pride he thought he had. Then, as if suddenly deciding that it wasn't enough to just humiliate the man mentally, Johnson's hand moved to his belt. "Now let's see what else you're hiding," he said with a smirk. more out of self-satisfaction than necessity. He wasn't concerned about the man's safety. The man was just another body to assert his dominance over. The real game wasn't about protecting anyone. It was about proving that Johnson was the one who decided who was free and who wasn't. "Turn around," Johnson ordered, his voice rough with authority. He was now completely intoxicated by the power, watching the man as if he were an object to control. "Arms out, spread 'em." The man complied, still silent, his back stiff. There was no defiance, no resistance, just an eerie calm that only further fueled Johnson's desire to break him. He was hoping to find something, anything, that would give him a reason to escalate this further. He wanted to push the man to the limit, make him beg, make him regret even existing in his path. "Nothing in your pockets?" "How convenient," Johnson mocked, his eyes narrowing as he moved his hands over the man's body, feeling the fabric of his clothes with deliberate slowness. "I bet you thought you could just walk through here, unnoticed, huh? Well, that's not how it works." As Johnson's hands moved lower, he could feel the man's body tense, but there was still no protest. The silence hung heavily between them. Johnson could sense the underlying power struggle, the conflict within the man, but it was clear he wasn't going to give Johnson the satisfaction of a reaction. "Should I be worried? Should I be afraid of you?" Johnson taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "You don't scare me. You're just another criminal hiding behind some facade. The truth is, you're just like every other black man I've ever had to deal with. You think you're different, but you're not. You think you're untouchable, but you're not." The words hit the air like sharp daggers, their cruelty evident in every syllable. Johnson didn't just want to assert his physical power. He wanted to remind the man of his place in the world. He wanted to make sure that no matter how much the man fought against him, there was no way out of this. The system was built for people like him to lose. Johnson was only doing what was expected of him, after all. And just as Johnson was about to wrap up his search, something shifted. He felt the presence of someone approaching, but the shift in energy was subtle. Was it just his paranoia? Or was it something else? Before he could react, the man's voice broke through the silence, cold and measured. "I don't need to prove anything to you." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, as if the man was daring him to continue. But Johnson was already so deep in his self-righteousness that he didn't even consider backing down. He was too far gone. There was no turning back now. "Yeah, we'll see about that," Johnson snarled, his voice low with finality. He stepped back, pulling his hand away from the man, his mind already racing through the next steps. This wasn't over. This wasn't even close to over. The power play was far from finished, and neither of them knew where it would lead. Johnson's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as he stood back from the man, eyes narrowed in cold triumph. He had humiliated him, forced him to obey, stripped away any pretense of power that the man may have thought he had. In the end, Johnson had won. That was all that mattered. He was the law, the authority. The man was nothing more than another face in the crowd. Another random encounter. Just another person to be controlled. But as he looked down at the man, his smug grin still intact, there was something else in the man's eyes. Something deeper. Something that made the air around them feel charged, electric with unspoken tension. Johnson ignored it at first, too wrapped up in his own sense of superiority to notice the subtle shift in the man's demeanor. It was then that the man spoke again, his voice calm, collected, almost unnervingly so. The man straightened up slightly, lifting his head, his eyes no longer avoiding Johnson's. For a moment, Johnson thought the man might be finally cracking, but the words that came next would strike him like a blow to the chest. "You don't recognize me, do you?" the man said, his tone not accusing, but heavy with an almost weary resignation. Johnson blinked, confused, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" he spat, his voice still laced with venom, as if trying to regain control of the situation. But the man simply smiled, a faint, knowing smile that sent a chill down Johnson's spine. "No," the man said, shaking his head slightly, his voice unwavering. "You don't recognize me, but I know exactly who you are." Johnson's heart skipped a beat. What the hell was this guy talking about? He'd stopped hundreds of people before, arrested even more, and yet this one had somehow made it past his radar. That smile, that calm demeanor, it didn't fit. It was as if the man knew something that Johnson didn't, something that was about to turn the tables on him in ways he couldn't even fathom. "You're just another thug on my street," Johnson muttered, still trying to regain control, but doubt began creeping in. "And I'll do whatever I want with you." The man let out a short, almost amused laugh. "You really think I'm just some random guy, huh?" he said, the edge in his voice sharpening, as if he was no longer playing along with Johnson's charade. Johnson took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the strange turn of events. This wasn't right. The man was too calm, too unbothered. And for a moment, Johnson's ego faltered. He knew the feeling, that strange unease that settled in his gut. It was the feeling he got when he was being outplayed, when the tables were about to be turned on him. "You're not even worth my time," Johnson spat, trying to regain his composure, but his voice had lost some of its bite. The man wasn't responding the way he expected. "Maybe I'm not worth your time," the man said, his voice low yet full of a quiet authority. "But I think you'll find that I am someone worth your respect." That made Johnson pause. Respect? From this man? Who was he kidding? The man's next words hit like a bombshell, his voice now carrying the weight of a revelation Johnson could never have prepared for. "I'm the head of internal affairs," the man said, and Johnson's blood froze in his veins. "That's right. I'm the one you've been ignoring all this time, the one you thought you could walk all over." Johnson's jaw went slack, his eyes widening in disbelief. It was as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted, the world around him suddenly tilting off its axis. Internal affairs? The very department that oversaw the police, that investigated misconduct, corruption, and every dirty little secret the department tried to hide. His mind raced. The words he'd said to the man just moments before, calling him a thug, a criminal, now replaying in his head. He had no idea who he had been dealing with. This was no ordinary suspect, no random passerby. This was someone with power, someone who could destroy his career with a single phone call. And Johnson had just humiliated him, tried to break him down as if he were nothing more than a statistic. For a moment, he stood there, frozen, trying to process the revelation, but his pride, his ego, kept him from fully comprehending the depth of his mistake. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his mind refused to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. He couldn't admit that he had messed up. Not like this. Internal affairs. The very people who had the power to expose every skeleton in his closet. He had been foolish, reckless, thinking that this was just another stop, another opportunity to flex his authority. But now, the reality of the situation was sinking in, and it hit him like a punch to the stomach. "You," Johnson started, his voice trembling slightly as the weight of the words settled on him. "Your internal affairs?" "That's right," the man said, his voice unwavering, but his eyes glinted with something darker now, something that made Johnson's blood run cold. "You've been running your little power trip around here, hurting people, intimidating people, without ever once thinking there might be consequences. Well, you're about to find out what those consequences are." Johnson's stomach churned. The man wasn't just going to let this go. And why would he? After everything Johnson had done, everything he had said, the racism, the threats, the humiliation, there was no way this was going to end without repercussions. But as the words sank in, Johnson's arrogance refused to let him back down. He clenched his fists, his mind frantically working to maintain control of the situation. "You're not going to do anything," Johnson spat, trying to summon whatever confidence he had left. "You can't. You think I care about internal affairs? I'm untouchable. I've been doing this job too long. I have connections. People who will protect me." The man's smile didn't falter. "You really think that's going to save you? You think your buddies in the department are going to cover for you when they find out what you've been doing? When they find out how many people you've hurt? How many lives you've ruined?" Johnson opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't have an answer. He couldn't argue with the truth. The man was right. The more he thought about it, the more the enormity of his mistake hit him. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and no matter how much he tried to deny it, the walls were closing in. "You're nothing but a coward," the man continued, his voice steady but full of disdain. "A bully hiding behind a badge, using your position to make people's lives hell. You don't even realize the kind of mess you've gotten yourself into, do you?" Johnson's hand tightened on his belt, his fingers brushing against his weapon. He felt a flash of panic, a fleeting instinct to take control, to overpower this man and put an end to this before it spiraled further. But as his hand hovered over his gun, he saw the look in the man's eyes, cold, calculating, unshaken. And for the first time, Johnson realized that he wasn't in control anymore. The man wasn't just a random civilian. He wasn't some criminal to be pushed around. He was someone who could bring Johnson down, someone who had the power to end his career, expose every rotten secret he'd kept hidden for years. He could burn Johnson's life to the ground with a single word. And in that moment, Johnson understood the true scale of his failure. He had no power here, not anymore. The man was right. The consequences were coming, and there was nothing Johnson could do to stop them. The weight of the revelation hit Johnson like a tidal wave, his thoughts swirling in confusion, disbelief, and mounting panic. Internal affairs. He had just humiliated, belittled, and threatened one of the most powerful people in the entire police department. And now, the reality of his mistake began to sink in. A crushing realization that there was no way out, no easy escape from the mess he had created. But as the man stood before him, unshaken, the raw, arrogant pride that had defined Johnson for years pushed through the panic. He couldn't back down now. He wouldn't. "You think you can threaten me, huh?" Johnson growled, trying to reassert his authority, his voice trembling but still trying to maintain the edge. His hand, which had been hovering near his holster, clenched tightly. He wasn't sure if he was just trying to comfort himself with the idea that his weapon would still give him control, or if he was finally willing to use it to end this once and for all. The thought flashed across his mind, but his resolve wavered. The man's eyes locked onto his, steady and unwavering, as though he could see through the fragile facade Johnson was desperately trying to hold together. There was no fear in those eyes, no hesitation, just a calm, almost detached understanding of what was happening, like he already knew how this would unfold. Johnson hated that look. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Johnson spat, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I'm untouchable. I have people, connections. You're nothing, just a small-time investigator thinking he can push me around." The words tasted sour in his mouth, but he spat them out anyway, hoping, praying, that they would somehow reaffirm his dominance in this situation. The man shook his head slowly, almost pityingly. "You're still trying to cling to that, aren't you?" he said, his voice a mixture of disappointment and cold contempt. "You're so used to throwing your weight around, so used to terrorizing people who don't have the means to fight back. And now, you're about to see what happens when you pick the wrong person to mess with." The man's voice had dropped lower now, harder, like a predator circling its prey. It was no longer a negotiation, no longer a mere warning. He was making it clear. The game had changed. "You think your badge protects you?" The man continued, his tone almost a whisper, but it was laced with the kind of authority Johnson had never been able to grasp, no matter how many years he'd been in the force. "Let me tell you something, Detective. I don't need a badge. I don't need a gun. I just need one simple phone call, one decision, and I could destroy your career, your life, in an instant. You could be out of this department, out of this city, in a matter of hours. People would forget your name faster than you could blink." The words hit Johnson like a slap to the face. He didn't know how to respond. He knew the man was right. He could be destroyed with a single call. Internal affairs had that power. They could bury him under layers of reports, investigations, and charges that would leave him powerless, jobless, and isolated. No amount of connections could save him. His whole career, everything he had built, was on the line. And yet, as panic rose within him, Johnson's pride refused to let go. He couldn't let this man break him, couldn't allow himself to look weak. No, he had to keep up the fight, even if it meant sinking lower than he ever had before. He could not let go of his pride, even if it cost him everything. "That's a nice threat," Johnson said, his voice tight, trying to force a sneer onto his face. "But you've made a mistake. No one threatens me, not like this. You think you can just come in here and take me down? I've been doing this for too long. I've seen men like you come and go. You're not the first one to try to scare me." The man didn't even flinch. He didn't flinch when Johnson's voice cracked with the weight of his own insecurity, nor when the faintest tremor of fear made its way into Johnson's tone. The man stood there, completely unmoved by the desperate words Johnson was throwing at him. "You really still don't get it, do you?" The man's voice was like ice now, hard and cold, completely devoid of emotion. "You're the one who's trapped. Not me. I don't need to threaten you. I've already won." Johnson's mind was reeling. He couldn't afford to back down, couldn't let this man see him weak. His body was tense, every muscle locked in place, ready for a fight that he wasn't sure he could win. But in that moment, the raw, visceral panic rose again, and Johnson snapped. "I'll make sure you regret this," Johnson snarled, his words spilling out before he could stop them. "I'll ruin you. I'll make you wish you had never crossed me. I'll put you in a position where you'll never be able to work again. I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are, what you really do. No one's untouchable, not even you." For a brief moment, the man's eyes softened, as if pitying Johnson. It was the kind of look someone might give a child, like they knew that child didn't have the faintest understanding of the consequences of their actions. "Is that really your move?" the man said, his voice dripping with disgust. "More threats? More intimidation? That's all you've got left, isn't it?" Johnson's fists clenched harder, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely out of control. His threats, his position, the arrogance that had served him for so many years. It was slipping away from him. The power he had wielded, the fear he had instilled in others, was nothing now, a useless shell in the face of this man who was standing so calmly, so effortlessly, in the storm. "You don't scare me," the man said, his voice calm but final. "What you're doing right now, this act of pretending like you're still in charge, it's over. I'm not scared of you, and I don't think you even realize how close you are to losing everything." Johnson's breath hitched in his throat as he realized the man was telling the truth. He was losing control. The fear, the anger, the confusion. They all swirled together, making his thoughts scatter, making his body tremble with the realization that he was powerless in this moment. For the first time in years, he couldn't dictate the outcome. He couldn't force things to go his way. He had pushed too far. He had crossed the line. And now he was facing the consequences. Real consequences. Not the empty threats he'd used to scare others into submission. His career, his reputation, his life. It was all hanging by a thread, and the man in front of him had the scissors. "You don't realize it yet," the man continued, his voice a whisper that was louder than any shout. "But you've already lost. You're not the one who holds the power here. Not anymore." Johnson opened his mouth to argue, to throw another insult, to try to push back, but the words died in his throat. The man's gaze pierced through him, and for the first time, Johnson felt what he had made countless others feel. Small, insignificant, utterly powerless. "You're a joke," the man said, his words cutting deeper than any blow Johnson had ever received. "You've always been a joke." The anger that had been boiling inside Johnson reached its peak, but this time there was no outlet for it. There was no power, no control, no way to reclaim the authority he thought he had. The man was right. This wasn't about physical power or threats. This wasn't about the badge or the gun. This was about something far deeper, something Johnson had never fully understood. True authority comes from respect, not fear. And in that moment, Johnson realized he had never commanded respect. He had only instilled fear. And that fear, it had just crumbled to dust. "Do it," Johnson said through gritted teeth. trying to force his voice to sound confident, but failing miserably. End it. You think you've got me? Go ahead. Take everything from me. I'll fight back. But the man only shook his head, his face a picture of cold indifference. I don't need to fight you, he said, the words coming out slowly, almost deliberately. You're already finished. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment settling into Johnson's bones. The confrontation had escalated beyond his wildest imagination, and now he was left standing, defeated, broken, not by force, but by his own hubris. The man turned and walked away, leaving Johnson standing alone, his world crumbling around him. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. Johnson stood there, his chest rising and falling rapidly, the realization of what had just unfolded gnawing at him. He had just threatened someone who was not only above him in the hierarchy of power, but someone who had the ability to destroy everything Johnson had worked for. The world around him felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls were closing in, and for the first time in years, Johnson felt a creeping fear he could not shake off. His mind raced, but it wasn't just the fear of losing his job or his power that clouded his thoughts. Something darker gnawed at him. Despite the revelation that he had been dealing with the head of internal affairs, despite the knowledge that he was now at the mercy of someone who could obliterate his career, Johnson's thoughts kept circling back to his actions, to how he had treated that man, how he had treated so many others before him. The deep-rooted prejudices, the hatred he had been so sure was justified, now seemed less like an outward expression of authority and more like something else, a reflection of his own insecurities. But Johnson wasn't ready to confront those insecurities. His mind, clouded by arrogance and years of unchecked power, pushed those thoughts aside. The shame he felt wasn't enough to break him. Not yet. Instead, it twisted into anger, resentment, and most of all, fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being exposed. You think you've won, don't you? Johnson's voice broke the silence, his words heavy with the attempt to regain his footing, to assert some semblance of control over the situation. His eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, a bitter laugh escaped him. You think that just because you wear a different uniform, you're better than me? The man didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence spoke volumes. And in it, Johnson could hear the truth that he had spent his entire career ignoring. His power, the fear he had instilled in others, was an illusion. It was built on a system that allowed men like him to operate with impunity, to abuse their authority, and to ignore the very people they were meant to protect. It was a system that had turned Johnson into a product of his environment, someone who had convinced himself that the color of his skin and the badge he wore made him superior. But now, with everything on the line, Johnson couldn't help but confront the ugly truth. His actions were not the product of a righteous cause. They were born from a place of deep prejudice, an ingrained belief that people like the man in front of him, people who weren't like him, were beneath him, and in that moment, the weight of his own racism crushed him. But instead of acknowledging it, Johnson doubled down, letting the familiar bitterness and rage take over once again. You're just like all the others, Johnson spat, his voice trembling now, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of anger. All you people think you can walk in here and challenge me, think you can come into my world and start making decisions about me. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You don't know what it's like to stand here, to hold this power. The man's eyes remained steady, unflinching. He had heard it all before, the same hollow justifications that men like Johnson clung to when they were cornered by the truth. There was no reason to argue, no need to waste energy on a man who had already lost the fight without even realizing it. But Johnson's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The man knew that the root of Johnson's anger wasn't just about the power he wielded. It was about the fear of being exposed, of realizing that the very system he had used to oppress others had also ensnared him in its lies. Johnson took a step forward, his voice now low, filled with venom. You think I'm going to sit here and let you ruin me? You think I'm just going to bow down to you because you're some so-called authority? I've worked too damn hard for this. I've put in my time. I've earned this, and I'll be damned if I let you take it from me." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he stood his ground, the calmness in his demeanor only making Johnson's words seem more desperate. There was no argument to win here, no battle to fight. Johnson was not dealing with a criminal or even an enemy. He was facing his own demons, his own beliefs about power, race, and authority that had been ingrained in him for years. "You've already lost," the man said softly, his words carrying the weight of someone who had seen this before. "Not to me, but to yourself. You've been living in a world where you think your badge and your skin make you superior. But you're wrong, detective. You're wrong about everything." The words hit Johnson like a hammer to the chest. For a brief, painful moment, he could see the truth of them. He was the one who had been blind all this time. He had built his career on the belief that power was about dominance, about control, about keeping people like the man in front of him beneath his boot. But now, that illusion was shattering. And yet, even with the truth laid bare before him, Johnson couldn't bring himself to let go. His mind raced, his ego pushing back, refusing to accept what the man was telling him. The system, his system, had always worked in his favor. Why should he believe anything else? Why should he let go of the power he had fought so hard to maintain? "You're just talking," Johnson sneered, his voice wavering as the fear began to claw at him. "Nothing you say will change anything. I've got the badge, I've got the power. You don't have anything." The man didn't respond with words. Instead, he took a small step closer, his presence almost suffocating now. Not out of aggression, but of quiet strength. It was clear that he wasn't going to engage in the petty back and forth Johnson was so desperate to hold on to. There was nothing more to say. Johnson had already sealed his fate. "You're wrong, detective," the man finally said, his voice calm but firm. "You've always been wrong, and now you're going to have to live with the consequences of everything you've done." Johnson's mind raced as he tried to push away the rising tide of panic, the suffocating sense of his own downfall closing in on him. The familiar comfort of his arrogance was slipping away. His grip on the power he had wielded for so long was weakening, and deep down, he knew that there was no way out of the trap he had set for himself. But Johnson wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. Not until he had one last chance to regain control, to assert his dominance over the man in front of him. "You'll never win," Johnson muttered, his voice cracking with the weight of his own desperation. "No one will ever believe you." The man simply looked at him, his gaze steady and unyielding. "It's not about belief, detective. It's about truth. And the truth is, you've been living a lie." As the man turned and began to walk away, Johnson stood frozen, his mind reeling, the realization of his own failure slowly creeping in. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The walls had closed in around him, and now it was only a matter of time before everything he had built came crashing down. For the first time, Johnson understood that the true power had never been in his hands. The power had always been in the truth. And now, the truth was going to tear him apart. Johnson couldn't let it go. The man from Internal Affairs had left, but the sting of defeat remained. He had been humiliated, exposed in a way he never thought possible, and the thought of that lingered in his mind. The truth hurt, more than he cared to admit. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his actions, his past mistakes, and the ugly reality of his own biases that had been laid bare. But there was one thing Johnson had always known. He didn't back down. Not ever. His pride, his sense of control, had always been his shield, and now he was determined to hold on to it, no matter what. The thought of losing his position, of being ousted from the force, gnawed at him. He had spent years building a reputation, creating a network of allies, and climbing the ladder. To have it all stripped away because of one misstep, one confrontation with someone he thought was just another target, was unbearable. Johnson couldn't help himself. He began reaching out to his colleagues, subtly testing the waters, trying to gauge their loyalties. He needed to rebuild his confidence, reassert his dominance in the only way he knew how, through manipulation. It started with casual conversations. At first, it was nothing more than small talk, but Johnson's questions grew more pointed. He mentioned the encounter, hinted at his frustrations with the department, and tested the waters for support. He wanted to see who would back him up, who would show any sign of loyalty. And for a while, it seemed like everything was going according to plan. These guys in internal affairs, they think they can just come in here and start making decisions about us, like we're nothing, Johnson said casually to one of his old friends from the precinct. It's a joke. They don't know how things work around here. His colleague, a seasoned officer, nodded slowly. Yeah, I get that. Internal affairs always sticks their nose where it doesn't belong. But you know, Johnson, maybe it's time we let the higher-ups handle this one. But Johnson didn't hear the caution in his friend's voice. He wasn't interested in anything other than gaining control of the narrative. He needed someone, anyone, who would stand with him, who would help him fight back against the exposure of his flaws. He needed reassurance that he wasn't alone. I'll handle it, Johnson said, his voice firm, trying to sound confident, even as doubt gnawed at him. I've been in this department longer than most of them. I've seen it all. I'm not going to let anyone walk over me. His colleague gave him a quick look, but didn't press the issue. Johnson dismissed it. He knew how to play the game. He'd been doing it for years. The system, after all, was built on favors, on alliances, on knowing who could be trusted. Johnson had built his position by knowing who to approach and when to ask for help. He just needed to remind everyone of the power he still held, the power he refused to let go of. As the days passed, Johnson's desperation grew. He began trying to rally a few officers who had been working under him for years. He played on their frustrations, their resentment of the system, and their shared disdain for the people who never had to get their hands dirty. He fed them half-truths and promises of protecting their interests, assuring them that together they could undermine the changes internal affairs was trying to bring about. Johnson knew that if he could sway the right people, he could turn the tide in his favor. He began to assemble a small group, whispering in their ears, telling them that the real fight wasn't against criminals. It was against the bureaucrats and the outsiders who didn't understand what it was like to work in the streets. The idea of an us versus them began to take root. But what Johnson didn't realize was that the man he had tried to humiliate was always several steps ahead. The officer from Internal Affairs wasn't just an investigator. He had been observing Johnson long before their confrontation. He knew exactly how people like Johnson operated, how they used manipulation, how they played on others' emotions to get what they wanted. The officer from Internal Affairs was intelligent, calculating, and while Johnson thought he was controlling the situation, the man was carefully laying the groundwork for his downfall. He had already begun to quietly gather information, speaking with other officers, digging into Johnson's past, and watching how Johnson was manipulating those around him. It wasn't about power, it was about justice. And he knew that, in the end, Johnson would expose himself with his own actions. Johnson's web of manipulation was tightening, but so was the noose around his neck. The more he tried to assert control, the more his actions revealed the cracks in his armor. He wasn't the powerful figure he had once thought himself to be. He was a man running on fumes, clinging to his past and trying to salvage what little he had left. The officer from Internal Affairs knew that Johnson's biggest flaw was his pride, and that pride was going to be his undoing. One afternoon, Johnson found himself in a meeting with several officers, discussing a case. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He was distracted by his plans, his attempts to bring together his network of loyalists. He kept glancing at the door, hoping for some sign of support from the officers he had been manipulating. But it wasn't coming. There was no loyalty in their eyes, only hesitation. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Johnson saw a familiar face, the officer from Internal Affairs. The man stood in the doorway, calm and composed, his presence filling the room. The sudden realization hit Johnson like a punch to the stomach. The officer had been watching him this entire time, waiting for him to make his move, to expose his hand. "I see you're still trying to rally the troops," the officer said, his voice even and devoid of emotion. Johnson's stomach turned. He tried to recover, to assert some form of dominance, but the words caught in his throat. The officer wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was calm, calculating. "You think you can control this situation?" the officer continued. "But the truth is, you've already lost. You're playing a game you can't win." The silence that followed was suffocating. Johnson felt the walls closing in around him, his pride, his sense of control, slipping further away. He had thought he could manipulate the situation, turn his colleagues into allies, but he had underestimated the officer's intelligence, his ability to see through the smoke and mirrors Johnson had built around himself. The officer stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. "This isn't a game, Johnson," he said, his voice low and firm. "This is about holding people accountable. And you can keep trying to play your little games, but you're going to lose everything in the end. Your actions, your choices, they will catch up with you." Johnson's breath caught in his throat. He realized then that this man had already won. He had seen through every attempt to manipulate, every play for power, and he had been waiting for Johnson to expose himself. And now, Johnson was trapped, his own arrogance and fear driving him to the point of no return. The officer's words hung in the air, a final warning. "This is over," he said. And as the officer turned and walked away, Johnson knew deep down that his fate was sealed. His attempts to rally support, to manipulate his colleagues, had only brought him closer to the end. There was no coming back from this. The truth had already begun to unfold, and nothing Johnson could do would stop it now. The moment the man revealed his true identity, everything shifted for Johnson. The room seemed to close in on him as the weight of the revelation settled in. This wasn't just some random officer. This was the head of internal affairs, the very person who had the power to destroy everything Johnson had built. His career, his reputation, his future, all hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of collapse. Johnson stood frozen for a moment, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. His mind raced. His career, which had taken years to build, was now threatened by a single, irrevocable mistake. The consequences of his actions were clear. And yet, despite the overwhelming pressure, there was a part of him that refused to let go. His pride, his sense of control, his belief in his own superiority had always been at the core of his identity. Even now, with everything on the line, he could feel that part of him clinging to power, no matter how misguided or delusional it was. "You think you've got me," Johnson muttered, his voice shaky but filled with defiance. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me?" The man looked at him calmly, almost with a sense of pity. "No," he said, his voice steady and without malice. "I'm not here to take anything from you. You've already done that to yourself." Johnson felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The truth of the man's words hit harder than any threat could. All the manipulations, all the intimidation, all the hatred he had harbored, it was all coming back to him. His actions, his prejudices, his refusal to confront the reality of the world around him had put him on this path. But even in the face of his inevitable downfall, Johnson's pride refused to back down. "You think this is over?" he spat. "I've worked my whole life to get where I am. You think you can just destroy me with a few words?" The man remained calm. "It's not about destroying you, Johnson. It's about holding you accountable. The truth is, you've hurt others. You've abused your power, used your position to belittle and intimidate people. And now it's time to face those actions." For the first time, Johnson's eyes flickered with doubt. The truth, harsh and undeniable, stood before him. He had used his position to control, to dominate, to manipulate others. He had convinced himself that it was justified, that the system supported him, that his actions were somehow acceptable. But now, in the face of the undeniable facts, he couldn't escape the weight of his own guilt. The man's voice softened, but the words still cut through the air like a knife. "You've lost control, Johnson. Your pride, your sense of superiority, it's all crumbling. And in the end, You'll have to answer for it." Johnson opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he realized that the power he had held over others was not real power. It was an illusion. A fragile mask held together by fear, not respect. And now, that mask was falling apart, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. "You can keep fighting," the man said, his tone calm but firm. "But in the end, it won't matter. The system is bigger than you, and the truth always comes to light." Johnson's chest tightened. His mind raced with thoughts of his career, his future, and the consequences of his actions. He knew he couldn't win this fight. Not anymore. His past had caught up with him, and there was no escaping it. But even as the weight of that realization pressed down on him, his pride still held on, refusing to let go. For a brief moment, he considered fighting back, making a final stand. But deep down, he knew it was over. The man from Internal Affairs was right. Johnson had already lost. The only thing left was to face the consequences of his actions. As the man turned to leave, Johnson stood there in silence, the weight of his own decisions settling in. He had pushed too far, taken too much, and now it was all slipping away. The pride that had once sustained him now felt like a burden, dragging him down into a place he couldn't escape. And as the door closed behind the man, Johnson understood that his career, his reputation, and his future had all been brought to this moment. A moment of truth, a moment of reckoning. The world outside the department had already begun to take notice. It didn't take long for word to spread about the events involving Detective Johnson. What had begun as a quiet conflict within the department soon erupted into a full-blown scandal that captured the attention of the media, public, and oversight organizations. The external pressure mounted quickly, and Johnson found himself under the harsh scrutiny of those he had never expected to face. His colleagues, who once respected him, began to distance themselves. Whispers spread like wildfire through the precinct. Officers who had long turned a blind eye to his actions now found themselves questioning their allegiance. Some of them had even heard the murmurs of the Internal Affairs investigation, and now it was clear Johnson had become a liability. At first, Johnson tried to maintain his grip on control. He downplayed the severity of the situation, tried to rally his old allies, and even attempted to reach out to those who might still support him. But the truth was undeniable. His arrogance, his racial biases, and his manipulation had finally caught up with him. A letter of inquiry from the Police Oversight Board arrived at the department, along with numerous complaints from community groups that had been affected by Johnson's actions. The pressure was mounting from every direction. The department faced an internal investigation, a public relations nightmare, and the possibility of widespread accountability. It was no longer just about Johnson's career. It was about the entire department facing its own flaws. Johnson's initial response was denial. He had always been able to get by with a forceful attitude and a knack for avoiding consequences. But the walls were closing in. The investigation wasn't just about his past misdeeds. It was about the culture of corruption, intimidation, and systemic abuse of power that had festered within the department. And now, Johnson was its poster child. He tried to push back, to manipulate the narrative in his favor, but his efforts only deepened the divide between him and his colleagues. Officers who had once looked the other way began to speak up. The truth about his actions, the racism, the violence, the manipulation, could no longer be hidden. It had all come to light, and the department was left to face the reality of what had been allowed to persist for so long. At the same time, the pressure from the public grew. Protests erupted outside the precinct, demanding justice not only for Johnson's actions, but for the systemic racism and brutality that so many had endured under the guise of law enforcement. The Black Lives Matter movement, alongside other activists and community leaders, rallied together to bring attention to the deeper issues within the police force. Johnson's behavior had become a symbol of a much larger problem, one that the public was no longer willing to ignore. The department, under mounting scrutiny, had no choice but to act. The chief of police, once a supporter of Johnson, now found himself caught between doing what was right and protecting the reputation of the department. But there was no avoiding the inevitable. An official suspension followed by an internal investigation was the first step. The public demands for justice were loud, and no amount of political maneuvering could shield Johnson from the consequences of his actions. As the investigation unfolded, Johnson's career crumbled. What had once seemed unshakable was now in ruins. His colleagues, who had once looked to him for leadership, now saw him for what he truly was: a man who had abused his position, manipulated his peers, and perpetuated harm within the very system he was supposed to protect. The truth was out, and no amount of arrogance could stop it from coming to light. The once proud detective was now left to face the reality of his downfall. His actions had not only destroyed his career, but had also contributed to the larger reckoning that was unfolding in the department and beyond. The impact of his behavior had far-reaching consequences, and he would have to answer for every choice, every action, and every life that had been affected by his disregard for justice. The fall of Johnson marked a turning point for the department. It was a painful, necessary moment of reckoning, but it also sparked the beginning of change. A reminder that no one, no matter their position or power, could escape the truth forever. Johnson's world crumbled in an instant. What had once seemed like a steady, unshakable career had now been reduced to dust. His name was no longer spoken with respect or reverence. It was a symbol of shame and failure. As the investigation into his actions unfolded, the evidence against him grew undeniable. The truth about his abuse of power, the manipulation, the racism, and the disregard for justice were too much to ignore. The department had no choice but to terminate him. His career as a detective, his reputation, the respect he had once commanded, all of it was gone in an instant. The colleagues who had once admired him now looked away, some with disgust, others with silent judgment. The friends he had thought would stand by him had abandoned him one by one. He was alone, left to face the consequences of his own choices. For Johnson, the realization hit like a freight train. He had spent his life chasing power, clinging to control, believing that his badge and his position would protect him from the consequences of his actions. But now, as he stood at the edge of everything he had built, he saw the truth for the first time. Power, when it is built on manipulation and fear, is fragile. It is fleeting, and it can vanish in an instant. The man he had tried to humiliate, the head of internal affairs, had remained a calm, steady force throughout the ordeal. His pursuit of justice had never wavered, even in the face of personal attacks and the backlash from Johnson's allies. The man's dedication to truth, to fairness, had been unwavering. He had known that this moment would come, but even he could not have anticipated the full weight of the tragedy that would unfold. While Johnson's life fell apart, the man continued his work, fighting for accountability and change within the system. His mission had never been about personal victory, but about righting the wrongs that had plagued the department for years. But as the days went by, the toll of the battle became evident. The fight for justice was exhausting, emotionally draining, and deeply painful. It had cost him more than he had ever expected. Yet he had no choice but to press forward, because in the end, justice could not be a fleeting thing, nor could it be silenced by those who tried to manipulate it. For Johnson, the realization of his loss hit harder than anything he had ever experienced. He had spent years building a life based on power and control, using his position to dominate others, to enforce his own sense of superiority. But in the end, he was left with nothing. The respect he had once commanded from his colleagues had evaporated. His career was over, and with it, his dignity. The personal pride he had once clung to so desperately now felt like a distant, irrelevant memory. His life had been defined by his need for power. But now, as he faced the consequences of his actions, he was left with the cold reality. Power was not worth it if it came at the expense of his integrity. The toll it took on his spirit was profound. Johnson had spent his entire life refusing to acknowledge his flaws, hiding behind his badge, his authority, and his misguided sense of entitlement. But now, in the quiet of his isolation, he could no longer ignore the truth. His career, his pride, and his sense of control had all been built on a foundation of lies. And now, as everything he had worked for slipped away, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions. The damage he had done, not just to others, but to himself. The man from internal affairs had won, not through force, but through perseverance and truth. His victory was bittersweet, because even as justice was served, it had come at a high cost. The personal sacrifices he had made, the emotional toll it had taken on him, were undeniable, but he knew that the work had to continue, because true justice was never easy, and it never came without a price. As Johnson sat alone, the weight of his past crushing down on him, he realized that the power he had once sought was no more than an illusion. It was a fleeting thing, always vulnerable, always at risk of slipping away. His life, his career, had been defined by his need to control others, to dominate, to instill fear. But now, as he faced the consequences of his actions, he understood the tragic truth. Control was never real. It was a fleeting fantasy that could be shattered in an instant. The tragedy of Johnson's downfall was not just in the loss of his career, but in the realization that he had wasted so much of his life chasing something that was never worth the cost. In the end, he was left with nothing. No career, no respect, no dignity. The only thing he had left was the bitter realization that the power he had sought so desperately was never truly his to keep. And as the man from internal affairs continued his work, fighting for justice in a broken system, Johnson was left to reflect on the emptiness of the power he had once held. His fall had been inevitable, and now all that remained were the consequences, for him and for those who had been affected by his actions.